Welcome to a special two-part edition of Philippine Hobby Community, the show where we talk about anything and everything hobby-related happening here in my home country, the Philippines. And today I'm very excited because we're talking about Arcus Paints, a new paint line that has just recently come out. This first part is all about our first impressions, and the second part will be a dance number. An interview with the owners to see if my first impressions do match the intent of them creating this very, very pleasing and wonderful professionally grade paint bottles. So let's talk about the packaging first, which you can see is very, very nifty. I really, really like it. It's so easy to organize. Behind this black cloth is a mess of clutter, and just having a little box to keep my professional grade single pigment paints are organized and kept well is very nice. You've probably already noticed that the bottle is very small, which I think there's a reason to why that is. One, it's obviously a starter set, but two, I think there's a lot of mileage you could get with this bottle. There's a cute little nifty QR code on the back of the label as well. You don't always get this box when you order from their store. You can request to have the ordered box. One of the issues that I recently found out was they said that each bottle had like a ball thing that would mix the paints. I don't hear it, man. Maybe it's because it's a starter paint. I don't know what's up with that. It's one of those paint brands that really screams out the name of the paint that you're looking at, which is really, really nifty because one, it's a small bottle, but also if you're painting and you have lots of your paints from afar, I can immediately see the name that I'm looking at. Of course, the color is right there, but they have different reds, they have different blues, they have different primary colors. To those uninitiated to traditional basic color sets, normally most color sets would have red, blue, yellow, both in a warm tone and in a cool tone, and this is exactly what Arcus Paints did. And what I find interesting is that they have a magenta color as well to add. What you digital artists know are the real true primary colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow. It's just that they're very rare pigments. So it's very cool that they have a magenta in here. I just don't know if this is how accurate of a magenta this really is as a primary color. They are advertised as single pigment professional grade paints, so that should speak heavily of what type of projects you should be using these paints with. Now let's get on to the performance of these paints, and of course I normally like to try the paints on a white, gray, and black. And as you can see, the performance is very, very interesting. As an army painter, I'm very used to working with paint sets of a wide variety of colors. That means there's a wide variety of thicknesses that I'll encounter because, as we know, pigments have different types of effects when they're turned into paint. Some paints are naturally thick and some paints are not naturally thick per line or depending on the line. But as per Arcus, every single paint color that they've had in this set so far has the consistent viscosity as it flows off the brush. These brush strokes are undiluted with water, maybe a little bit because of the wet palette, but they've always had an inky consistency, and I've been holding this thing upside down the whole time. And in most brush strokes, you already have a high opacity level at the gray at one coat or one layer. I'm thoroughly impressed. Look at how matte this thing dries. Look at how flat each thin layer is without even having to dilute it. Because the consistency of each paint is very, very similar to one another, squeezing them out of the bottle is very easy. It's very predictable. If I want one drop, it's very easy to get. It's one of the most easiest to control dropper bottles, not because of the dropper bottle, but because of the paint inside. If you look at it, the paint doesn't drip out of the nozzle. It's very easy for it to clean itself as the paint just comes back in. I do have to say though that some of these paint bottles have like a weird ring on the cap, and when you like tilt it, most of the rings fall out, which is kind of a little bit annoying. Maybe it's just the quality of the supplier of their paint caps or something, but I've just opted to remove all those rings altogether. But whatever, it's a small thing. Let's get on to painting an actual miniature. Before that, I wanted to plan my palette, and this is the palette that sort of figured out. And I do have to say, this is a really, really highly opaque paint. After asking the owners why is that so, they really intentionally wanted to make it a highly opaque paint, which has some crazy side effects or crazy effects that you can do with it. Their chemist claims that there is more pigment than binder in this paint, meaning this is a water-based acrylic paint, meaning there's water, acrylic, and paint pigment. Paint pigment, that makes the most of this paint. It creates such a highly opaque base color over gray in most paints without dilution in one layer, and it's very, very, very opaque. I guess for people who like freehand, this could be a good or a bad thing. The more skilled you are and confident, I guess this is a very, very good thing. Because it's a lot of pigment and not a lot of binder, it doesn't dry as fast, making it very ideal for mixing wet on wet, meaning apply base coat and another wet base coat next to it to blend the two layers. It's very, very easy to get even base coats because of its opacity and its ability to maintain its thinness. What is quite a challenge is for it to get a glaze consistency. But because you may have to add more water than the usual to get a glaze consistency than compared to most paints, there is that notion that you might break the paint, meaning you might add too much water and the whole mixture will just be over diluted and won't behave like paint anymore. But in my experience, I don't think I've ever over diluted or broken the paint, no matter how much water I've added to the mixture. Now, I haven't put it through a stress test, but I'm able to come up with the glaze consistency that I'm happy with. As far as breakage, it only created tide marks, which is to my fault. But other than that, it's a nicely operating paint. And once you get that glaze on, it creates an even transparent layer and really behaves like a nice tint or a glaze. One thing to note is that if you're like me who's used to army painting, when we mix colors, we tend to make them in big batches, especially if we're doing troop lines. But I decided on painting a small figurine first because I do want to see how great it performs on a display painting level, because I did hear a rumor that you do become a better painter when you start using this. I think, or I assume, that high pigment paints behave more like watercolors, because watercolors pigments are very, very strong and irreversible. So the darker the watercolor, the more it can overpower a lighter watercolor like a black or a blue over a yellow. You've played with watercolors, you know what happens when you put like a drop of dirty paint on your yellow. You just mess up the whole yellow. Initially, I put a 1:1 ratio that just fucked it up. It just turned my entire base black. I wanted a reddish hue in the center and then tapering off into a darker red. I was just surprised at how intense a droplet of black was. It just turned it really, really dark. Can be a good thing, but it's one thing to take of note when you're starting with Arcus paints for the first time. Read the label. Because in the label, all the bottles say, which I failed to see, was to shake well, high pigment content, use sparingly when mixing with colors. Store with cup, type sealed. When painting with Arcus paints, I think one of the key aspects here, especially if you're going to be doing display painting and you want to sort of come up with a gradient effect, I think the key really here is to paint your base coat first. And because it's high pigment, the darker colors will easily cover up their base coat. You can turn your dark color or shadow color into a glaze, and you can easily come up with a nice gradient, assuming you know how to glaze properly, really, really quickly with less amount of layers. Normally, I would have to go back with like 20, 30, 50 layers to come up with a nice glaze. For Arcus paints, I just had to like come up with maybe like less 10 layers to come up with a really, really passable glaze. The challenge for glazing or highlighting with Arcus paints is that the lighter pigmented colors such as white and yellow they really will naturally take up more layers than usual to come up with a solid color that you're happy with. But if you're only using it to highlight or make a gradient, it's still gonna take less effect or less layers than compared to other paint brands. Now, disclaimer, this is the first professional grade paint that I've tried or been exposed to. I haven't put this against more established professional paint brands like Chimera and such. If you guys are like me, who's very used to army painting, Arcus is a good springboard because it's very, very affordable. It's easy to get. You can contact me if you have any questions about it. I can throw the questions to the owners, or you can message their Facebook page. Basically, it's a very low entry point to get into display painting, and I do believe I did get a little bit better with my painting as the rumor dictates. Now, I initially wanted to show you guys the main output I had, but unfortunately I really got into it and I really wanted to make it look really, really good. I've been painting this miniature for over a week, and I just want to use Arcus paints to the best of my ability so I can give a fair review of it, as this is just my first impressions. Part 2 will include a an interview with the owners, as well as me exploring other techniques with this besides just glazing and base coating, but also we'll talk about highlighting, edge highlighting, and dry brushing with these highly pigmented, thin paints. Just a few notes before we head out. These paints really last long on the palette. I don't see myself having a lot of wastage with my paints because I've left a puddle of paint there for maybe 3 days, and there is some separation to it, but I just had to mix it a little bit, and it was just like it was the same fresh paint I've gotten straight from the bottle. The paint lasts long on the palette as long as it's not mixed with another color and it maintains the original puddle. 2, it's really meant to be a high opacity paint. The owners were telling me that they brought the paints through a lot of rigorous testing with a lot of hobbyists. Actually, I never got to thank them. They actually sent me this paint kit for free because they wanted me to test it, and I'm very, very happy. And it's that type of testing that makes products like these really, really great. I personally recommend it, even if it's just my first impression. Because they're meant to be highly opaque paints, I think it's expected, or it's normal for you, if you want to have glazes or gradients, to really apply a lot of water, as I did not experience the paint from breaking. And I do like it being high opacity because I can come up with effects a lot quicker than normal paints. It's just that it takes a little bit more work to get to that paint consistency. But if you think about it, that work is a nice trade-off, because when you start applying your layers, you need to apply less layers. What I did notice also, and I wish that my footage captured, but my big head is blocking my camera, that it was very, very easy for me to come in with a small or pointed brush and hit very, very thin lines. On this flag banner, I only used a single brush size for the details. And if you notice the highlights on the leaves, I did not even dry brush those. I individually placed those highlights, not because I'm a masochist, but really it was very easy for the paintbrush to load up a lot of this paint but still maintain that sharp point. So I'm able to get precise dots and highlights and strokes on a single layer. The high pigment nature of it allows me to come in and put very, very little paint and still come up with a nice opacity. Because it's a highly pigmented paint, it's a thin paint, I think. I'm not a chemist, but I would assume that's the reason. There's not a lot of binder, there's nothing making it thick. So if I have a paintbrush that's this pointy and I put some water over it, you'll notice most paintbrushes bloat up and you lose the point. That's why we have to wick most of the excess paint off. For Arcus paints, most of the time when you load up the brush alone, you don't even have to wick as much paint off for it to have that tip. And it's very, very helpful. I've gotten into so much nooks and crannies, and mind you, for those people who are experienced in Games Workshop models, this is a resin kit, so it's not really the best kit for painting. And there's lots of nooks and crannies which this paint brand allowed me to get into with, of course, my thin paintbrush. To conclude, I'd like to pose a question to the owners. Correct me if I'm wrong, if this first impression was right or not. I believe this is really for professional grade painting. But I would like to add that it is a nice entry point for beginners who want to get into more professional level paints. Yes, there's a hurdle for it being highly pigmented, but I think that high pigmentation or opacity speaks to the impatience of an army painter when they want to apply a base coat. They want that effect fast. In the next episode, you guys will get to see the talented faces behind Arcus paints, and I say talented because all of them, I think, are award-winning painters locally here, if I'm not mistaken. They have a lot of experience into gunpla and scale modeling, not just miniature painting. They're accomplished commission artists. A lot of them I actually idolize. And I'm sure for you people who are into the miniature scene, if you guys were in Brush Masters last month, the three of them won awards and were mentioned in that contest. There's a lot of talent behind this paint brand. It's really by and for the hobbyists, which makes it a very exciting episode for me. So please stay tuned. In 2 weeks, I will show you guys the main output of what I have created with these paints, and also you guys will get to meet the owners of Arcus Paints. We'll be dry brushing, edge highlighting, and even adding additives to this paint in the following episode too. So please stay tuned. This has been Louis of Louis Loves Minis, reminding you to hobby every day to keep the sprues